There's a lot to be said for having your heart in the right place. And of all the things you can say about Star Trek, to its credit and to its detriment, you have to give it that much. Its heart has nearly always been in the right place. Of all the TV shows and movies ever produced, few, if any, have tried harder to encourage social progress and say things that need to be said. But intentions aren't everything. So, thoughtful and conscientious Trekkies that we are, I thought it would be good to look at a few times when Star Trek failed to live up to its ideals as we explore the question, is Star Trek actually less progressive than you think? Now, it just so happens that this has been a hot topic of conversation within Star Trek fandom over the past couple of months, thanks mostly to some controversial statements of a prominent Star Trek cast member. Jesus! Kate Mulgrew. Sorry, for a second there I thought you were Captain Janeway. Anyway, back in July, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing, Radio Times published an interview with Kate Mulgrew, who narrates an Audible documentary series about the space race between the US and the Soviet Union, ingeniously titled The Space Race. Most of the interview is pretty routine. She promotes her series, she talks about the history of the space program, she takes a few shots at Donald Trump, solidarity, Kate, but then, right at the end, the writer of the piece, Jonathan Holmes, asks her about the negative reaction to Star Trek Discovery from a certain segment of the fan base. And Kate says, quote, "I don't think you should be surprised by that. Did you watch the original series? It was extremely misogynist. That's what it was for years, and Picard followed that to a certain extent. Roddenberry himself was that way. We are simply going to have to change this sensibility, this ideology, and we are, but it's like moving granite. It takes a long time. We are not a society that has endorsed females as equals to males on television." Misogyny in Star Trek? The most progressive and inclusive show ever? How dare she? And gender inequality on television? What the hell would Kate Mulgrew, a woman who's worked in television since the 1970s, know about that? So let's start there. Is the first woman to lead a Star Trek series right about the original series being misogynist? Was Picard misogynist to a certain extent? Should I stop framing foregone conclusions as open questions and find a different rhetorical device to use during lead-ins? Star Trek the original series was very progressive in its treatment of women in many ways, particularly for its time. The regular cast featured a black woman in a featured supporting role. One of the most frequently seen recurring characters was a woman. The male characters, even alleged skirt chaser Captain Kirk, often pay lip service to the idea of women being of equal worth to men. In the United States in the late 1960s, when the women's liberation movement was becoming more prominent but also facing ever-growing resistance, Star Trek's depiction of women as strong, competent, and deserving of equal consideration to that afforded to men was bold and forward-looking. And there's evidence to suggest that Gene Roddenberry wanted to go even further in presenting a future free of sexism and gender inequality, Exhibit A being the character of Number 1 in the original pilot, but was held back by reluctant network executives. But even progressive people, or TV shows created by progressive people, can have their vision obstructed. And for all the ways we might rightly hail classic Trek as feminist, there are many instances where it is anything but. Some of these instances are subtle. Ever notice how often Uhura tells the captain she's scared while in a dangerous situation? Okay, it's maybe 2 or 3 times over the course of the whole series, but were any of the male characters ever written that way? Did Bones ever stare beseechingly into Kirk's eyes and say, "Jim, I'm frightened"? But some of these instances are impossible to miss, especially when we look back on them from our modern era, where the problems of gender inequality and sex discrimination have long since been resolved. Probably the most egregious example of overt misogyny in Star Trek the original series is that time they devoted an entire episode to it. And also it was the last episode the show ever produced. The episode to which I'm referring is called Turnabout Intruder. The Enterprise responds to a distress call on Camus 2. Kirk, Spock, and McCoy beam down, and it turns out the leader of an archaeological expedition on the planet is one of Kirk's ex-girlfriends, Janice Lester. She's unconscious when they arrive, so Kirk stands at her bedside like, "Dr. Lester? Dr. Lester," until she wakes up. Spock detects some almost dead people down the hall, so he, McCoy, and Dr. Lester's colleague, Dr. Coleman, go to check it out, leaving Kirk and Lester alone. Lester comes to a little more, and she's like, "Remember back in the day when you and me were a thing for a year and everything was great until I remembered that my life was destined to be shit because women aren't allowed to be starship captains?" And Kirk's like, "Oh, sure." Then Kirk's like, "As long as you're feeling better, I'm gonna take a random, totally unmotivated stroll to the other side of the room here." And Lester's like, "I'm so glad you did that. It makes what I'm about to do so much easier." And she sits up and pushes a button on a space clicker, and Kirk gets stuck to the wall. And Lester walks over and flips a switch and stands next to him, and they pull a Freaky Friday. Though Freaky Friday didn't come out until a few years after this episode. So did Freaky Friday pull a Star Trek? Technically no. By the 1960s, the body swap had become a somewhat common trope in comic and fantasy fiction. According to Memory Alpha, Turnabout Intruder is directly inspired by Thorne Smith's 1931 novel Turnabout. However, the most notable example of the trope up to that point was probably the Victorian novel Vice Versa by F. Ansley, in which a father and son magically trade places and learn valuable lessons about each other. Is Vice Versa grossly misogynistic? I mean, it was published in 1882, so yeah, probably. But I've never read it, so I can't say for sure. Speaking of gross misogyny, before we get back to Turnabout Intruder, I want to address one particular line of Janice Lester's. It's when she says to Kirk during their initial conversation, "Your world of starship captains doesn't admit women." This line is usually interpreted to mean that women are formally prohibited from serving as starship captains, an inequality that fuels Lester's resentment and lust for revenge against Kirk, whom she comes to see as the personification of everything she's been denied simply for being a woman. Thankfully, subsequent Star Trek shows chose to either reject this interpretation or ignore it. We see women commanding Starfleet ships in every other Star Trek series. Most notably Voyager, of course, where the series lead is a woman captaining a starship, and Discovery, which features a woman captaining the starship Shenzhou, and takes place prior to the events of Star Trek TOS. But no matter how we interpret Lester's "your world of starship captains doesn't admit women" line, whether we take it as a statement about sexist Starfleet policy, or as more of a rhetorical lament about how career-oriented Starfleet officers don't have time for romance and family, Turnabout Intruder is one of the most problematic episodes of classic Trek or any Trek series. Lester Kirk tries to take command of the Enterprise, but Kirk Lester wakes up and rats her out. The rest of the crew is skeptical at first, but after a mind meld, Spock accepts that Kirk Lester is the real Captain Kirk. So Lester Kirk charges Spock with mutiny. At Spock's court-martial, Lester Kirk is like, "There's no such thing as a body swap. Janice just made it up because she hates me, because she's a jealous loser, and Spock is going along with it because he wants to take over as captain. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna have a recess, and then we're gonna come back and vote, and it's gonna be curtains for you, Spock. Curtains!" They take a recess, and Scotty catches up with McCoy in the hallway, and he's like, "Does the captain seem a little hysterical to you?" And McCoy goes, "Now that you mention it, he has seemed extra bossy lately." They go back in, and Lester Kirk is like, "I heard what you said about me in the hallway just now, so guess what? Death penalties for everybody." Lester Kirk tells Coleman, "Okay, time to make this a permanent swap. Stop being such a wuss and go kill my old body just like you killed all our friends on Camus too." And Coleman's like, "God, you're such a nag." And he prepares a poison hypo spray, and they go down to the holding cell where Kirk Lester is being held with Spock, McCoy, and Scotty. Coleman tries to dose Kirk Lester with the hypo, but they struggle, and then the body swap spontaneously reverses itself, and Lester, back in her own body, starts crying like, "I'll never be the captain!" And Coleman embraces her and says, "It'll be okay, because I love you, by the way, and also I guess I'm not going to be punished for helping you murder all of our colleagues." And Kirk watches McCoy lead Lester and Coleman away, then turns to Spock and Scotty and goes, "It's too bad. Her life could have been as rich as any woman's, if only she would have been more chill about the toxic gender inequality that pervades our supposedly evolved institution." Ah well, you guys want to take a few years off and then come back as cartoons? Now, some of you might argue that Dr. Janice Lester is the villain of the piece, and her instability and general murderishness should therefore not be taken as Star Trek's commentary on all women. And that's fair. But Lester is the only major female character in the episode. Nurse Chapel pops up for a scene or two, but does nothing of note, and there's also Lieutenant Lisa filling in for Uhura. Nichelle Nichols had a scheduling conflict, hence her absence from the episode, but Lisa doesn't do much more than push buttons and recite some standard dialogue. The only female character who really matters to the story of the episode is Dr. Janice Lester, who hates being a woman so much that she possesses Captain Kirk and spends the rest of the episode trying to kill her own body while being described by various other male characters as emotionally unstable, erratic, and hysterical. Not a good look for a series with a commitment to equal representation as part of its mission statement. Things look even worse when you take into account the fact that the story credit for Turnabout Intruder goes to Gene Roddenberry himself. Then again, it can't be all Roddenberry's fault. It seems clear that he was harboring some unacknowledged biases and erroneous assumptions regarding gender, but aren't we all? There are cringe-inducing portrayals of women found throughout the Star Trek franchise. Not even the patron saint of evolved humanity, Jean-Luc Picard himself, is immune. Remember the episode In Theory, when Data starts dating a human woman and is going around asking all his friends for their best romantic tips, and Picard tells him, "I'd be delighted to offer any advice I can on understanding women. When I have some, I'll let you know." Because chicks, am I right? Before I move on to other areas where Star Trek has occasionally been other than its best self, I want to recommend the recent video Jessie Gender produced on Star Trek's treatment of women. Jessie devotes her entire video to the subject, goes a lot more in depth than I do here, and examines what was going on behind the scenes of the various Trek shows, as well as what happens on screen. Jessie was kind enough to ask me to contribute some voice work, which I happily did. The video is fantastic. It's linked in the description of this video, and I strongly suggest you check it out if this is a topic that interests you. Now then, let's talk about how racist Star Trek is. Because a white guy leading a discussion about racism always goes well. This one can be the most difficult shortcoming for many of my fellow Trekkies to accept. Because of all the bigoted isms that plague our society, racism is the one Star Trek has made a point of opposing most often and most overtly. How can a show as willfully, unabashedly anti-racist as Star Trek possibly be racist? I'm gonna tell you. And I'm going to start with another of the most universally derided episodes in the whole franchise, a Season 1 outing from Star Trek The Next Generation, titled Code of Honor. In this show, only the third episode of TNG to be broadcast, the crew of the Enterprise D visits planet Ligon 2. The Ligonians manufacture a vaccine that is needed to treat an outbreak of plague on a Federation planet, so Picard and company have been dispatched to make nice and get the medicine. The Ligonian delegation beams aboard the ship, and... oh boy. How to describe the Ligonians. So, the Ligonians are the stereotypical Africans that a stereotypical clueless mid-20th century white writer would create to give their pulp adventure stories some exotic flavor. They dress in turbans and sashes and parachute pants, and everything is sparkly because it's the future, and they're aliens, I guess. They speak with pronounced African accents. Their culture is aggressive, crudely misogynistic, and obsessed with projecting strength and status. And just to make all that already shitty stuff even shittier, while the senior staff and the Ligonians are exchanging gifts and pleasantries in the observation lounge, Picard tells them they have a, quote, unique similarity to an ancient Earth culture we all admire. Did he, some of our best friends are black, an entire planet? And is he thinking of any particular African culture, or just doing what us folks of predominantly European descent usually do and treating Africa as a cultural monolith? Either way, if I were a member of whatever ancient Earth culture Picard is talking about, I'd be insulted. He's basically saying, you remind us a lot of these people from our home planet. They were savage buffoons too. The Ligonians are such racist caricatures that, first chance they get, they kidnap a white woman. Just like the natives of Skull Island and King Kong. Even in deep space in the 24th century, black men are coming for our white women. It turns out abducting Tasha is all part of a plan by Lutan, the leader of the Ligonians, to set up a fight between Lieutenant Yar and his wife, Yarina. Yes, Yar versus Yarina. How that made it into the shooting script, I don't know. I mean, gross racial stereotypes are one thing, but cornball, on-the-nose character names? Come on, folks, are we professionals here or what? Anyway, if Tasha kills Yarina, then, according to Ligonian custom, Lutan inherits all of Yarina's wealth. So they fight to the death, and Tasha wins, then they're both beamed aboard the Enterprise. Lutan is thrilled at the death of his wife, and he tells Picard to take the vaccine, which Picard does. But then, back aboard the Enterprise, Lutan discovers that Yarina has been revived by Dr. Crusher. Since Yarina is alive, she gets to keep her wealth, but since she did technically die before Dr. Crusher brought her back, her marriage to Lutan is dissolved. The Ligonians beam back to their planet, and the Enterprise warps the hell out of there like, thanks for the medicine, suckers! Bigoted, colonialist, and just an all-around crummy episode, Code of Honor is arguably the low point of the entire Star Trek franchise. Yeah, Spock's Brain and Threshold and Star Trek V are all terrible, but at least they aren't blatantly racist. It's one thing to make a lousy episode. It's another thing to make an episode that is reprehensible on a moral level. Thankfully, there aren't too many more Star Trek episodes like that, and none that are nearly so egregious. But even when it's trying to say something positive, Star Trek occasionally gets it wrong when it comes to racism. One of the preachiest episodes any Trek series has ever produced, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield from Classic Trek's third season, carries a heavy-handed but commendable anti-racism message. We meet Lokai and Beale of the planet Sharon. Lokai is white on the right side, Beale is black on the right side. The distinction seems trivial to everyone else, but to them, it's of the greatest importance. Those on Sharon who look like Beale, black on the right side, have been persecuting those who look like Lokai, white on the right side, for tens of thousands of years. Though we have only their testimonies to go by, it seems clear that Beale is the oppressor, the agent of an authoritarian regime, and that Lokai is the victim of Beale's oppression. And yet, by the end, the episode has established this sense of equivalence between them, as though they're both equally to blame for their predicament. When they arrive at Sharon, having spent the last 50,000 years running across the galaxy, Lokai and Beale find that everyone is dead. The half-whites and half-blacks having annihilated each other in a global civil war. Lokai and Beale return to their dead planet to continue their struggle against each other. It's a very Twilight Zone-ish twist, and definitely hammers home the destructiveness and ultimate futility of intolerance. The episode ends with the crew trying to make sense of it all, ultimately deciding that it doesn't matter which one of them was right, because in the end, all Lokai and Beale had left was their determination to destroy each other. Anybody else see a problem with an anti-racism allegory where the parting message is mutual hatred is bad instead of, I don't know, persecuting people because of their skin color is bad? Because Beale is definitely the villain of the piece. Lokai isn't the most charming fellow, but he's nowhere near as sinister and threatening as Beale. It's obvious that Beale is the hunter and Lokai is the prey, and that Beale's justifications for hunting Lokai are rooted in prejudice rather than in anything legitimate. Yet the episode ends with Captain Kirk and the rest of the crew just kinda shaking their heads sadly and going, what a shame that their hatred consumed them both. It's all just a little too gutless and centrist for my taste. I'm Team Lokai all the way. I hope he killed that Riddler-looking shit-ass after they beamed down. I want to quickly look at two more areas where Star Trek has occasionally fallen short. First, its treatment of LGBTQ characters. The biggest problem here is that for most of Star Trek's 50-plus year history, there weren't any LGBTQ characters. There were characters who seemed to be analogous to a gay person or a trans person, like Jadzia Dax or Soren from the TNG episode The Outcast, but it wasn't until Star Trek Beyond established that its version of Sulu was gay that a regular Star Trek character was unambiguously presented as having an LGBTQ identity. A year later, Star Trek Discovery became the first TV series in the franchise to have regulars who were gay. Lieutenant Commander Stamets and Dr. Culber. Star Trek Beyond opened in 2016, and Discovery's first season debuted in 2017. The first season of Star Trek the Original Series premiered in 1966. That's a long time to wait for a handful of openly gay regular characters, especially for a franchise so committed to being progressive and socially conscious. The lack of representation isn't the only problem with how Star Trek has dealt with LGBTQ-related issues. Just as has sometimes been the case when it's dealt with racism, occasionally when Star Trek has tried to strike a blow in favor of tolerance and acceptance, the result has been a swing and a miss. One example of that is an episode I just mentioned, The Outcast, which aired during the 5th season of Star Trek The Next Generation. On the surface, it seems like a solid social issue episode. There's a character who is unfairly persecuted, who stands up for her rights and ultimately fails, leading to a tragic ending that emphasizes the importance of fighting the injustices people like her face here in the real world. But a closer inspection reveals a few problems. For one thing, while the episode argues strongly that a person should be allowed to live freely and equally regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, it does so while reinforcing both the notion that gender is binary and heteronormativity. When Soren, a member of the Janai, a species of individuals who typically have no gender, is explaining her predicament to Riker, she lays it out in black and white terms. While most Janai have no gender, there are some who identify as having a gender, either male or female. And these people seek each other out to have relationships. Heterosexual relationships, as Soren tells it. Now, this episode was produced in 1992, but nevertheless, it's possible that Jerry Taylor, the credited writer of this episode, or someone else involved in the production, recognized that this was a simplistic and reductive way of presenting sexuality and gender identity, but decided to go ahead with it so as not to clutter the episode with what to most viewers, including myself at the time, would have been complicated and potentially confusing ideas about sex and gender. Still, it feels like a missed opportunity. The same goes for Riker's confusion over what pronouns to use for a gender-neutral species. He's like, should I call you it? I guess, what, Z or some other gender-neutral pronoun hasn't caught on by the 24th century? And before any of you remind me of what I just said, that the episode was produced in 1992, there were several gender-neutral pronouns floating around by 1992, including Z, spelled XE, which was first proposed in the 1970s, and Thon, which never gained widespread acceptance but dates all the way back to the 1850s, and let's not forget they, which, contrary to what certain know-nothing know-it-all right-wing podcasters might have us believe, besides being the plural form of he, she, and it, has also been used as a gender-neutral singular pronoun since at least the year 1375. That's according to the Oxford English Dictionary, a somewhat reputable source, I believe. So let's not fall prey to the misconception that gender-neutral pronouns were just invented a few years ago. Okay? The biggest issue with The Outcast has to do with its ending. And it's an issue I never noticed before I discussed this episode with some gay and trans friends of mine. Janai society is extremely intolerant of people like Soren who identify as either male or female. Such people are forced to undergo a form of conversion therapy. Soren doesn't want this and pleads her case before a tribunal, asserting her right to be who she is with passion and eloquence. But her words fail to move the authorities, and she's forced to take the treatment. Riker, who has fallen in love with Soren and wants to save her from being tortured and brainwashed, beams down to rescue her, but he's too late. Soren has already been subjected to the gender identity lobotomy. No longer the person she was, she apologizes to Riker and tells him to leave. A free spirit forced to conform, a love denied because of the close-mindedness of others. A tragic ending. A powerful ending. That's what I thought anyway. But when I talked about The Outcast with some LGBTQ friends, several of them pointed out that in order to get us to that tragic, powerful ending, Soren undergoes conversion therapy, and it works. And that's the problem, because in real life, conversion therapy doesn't work. So far as we can tell, gender identity and sexual orientation are immutable traits. They can be complex, they can be difficult to understand, they can be confusing, but they can't be altered in the way advocates of conversion therapy suggest. You can't take a gay person and transform them into a hetero person. You can't take a trans person and change them into a cis person. Except, apparently, on the planet Janai. I want to emphasize again that I don't think these problems are intentional. I think Jerry Taylor wanted to write an episode that would play as pro-LGBTQ, in favor of tolerance and acceptance and equality, and for the most part, I think she succeeded. And if she and others involved in the making of the episode had enjoyed a bit more creative freedom, the episode's message might have landed even more strongly than it did. Jonathan Frakes has said repeatedly that he thought the Janai characters should have been played by male actors, to emphasize the episode's statement against homophobia. Executive producer Rick Berman apparently didn't agree, and Soren was played by Melinda Kalea, a terrific actress who does a fine job, but even so, casting a woman to play Riker's love interest in an episode that argues for acceptance of gay people feels like the safe choice rather than the best choice for the story and the message. Despite the issues I've just been describing, I find The Outcast to be a very effective episode. Its shortcomings shouldn't be ignored, but they are most likely the result of unconscious bias and ignorance. I'd wager those factors are also to blame for the problems with how Star Trek deals with the subject of sexual assault. There's not really a single episode that works as a microcosm for how Star Trek mishandles sexual assault, but there is a single character that can serve that function. Yes, it's our old friend Counselor Troi. Hope there's no hard feelings about that time I made a whole video arguing that Guinan should have your job. Okay. Actually, since I mentioned it, in that video I talk about how poorly treated the character of Deanna Troi is by the writers of TNG. That poor treatment consists not just of the writers making her a lousy ship's counselor, but also of how often they placed Deanna in jeopardy by making her the target of rape in one form or another. In TNG's second season premiere, The Child, Troi is impregnated by a mysterious alien being without her knowledge or consent. Troi describes how a presence entered her body while she slept, and the crew briefly discusses what should be done about the pregnancy before Troi pipes up to remind them that it's up to her whether she has the baby or not, which is good. No one ever suggests that a violation has been committed. Troy's pregnancy progresses rapidly, and she has the baby like the next day. Troi names him Ian, and he soon grows to the size of a 4-year-old human child, then dies, explaining to Troi before departing the ship in his natural energy form that he was just curious about humans and decided to go through the life cycle to learn more. Which is all well and good, but hopefully before Ian took off, Troi told him, "Next time you want to study what it's like to live as another species, ask before you enter someone's body and knock them up with your presence, okay?" A few years later, in Season 5's Violations, the crew of the Enterprise hosts members of a telepathic species, one of whom, it turns out, has been assaulting crew members by invading their memories without permission. The assaults leave people comatose. So far, so good. Telepathic assault as a metaphor for sexual assault. The perpetrator is the son of one of his people's most respected historians, showing that rapists can and do occupy any social class. And the psychic assaults, like real-life rapes, are shown to not be about sex, but about power and domination. Well done on all of that. Unfortunately, in addition to making her the episode's first victim of the psychic assault, The writers also decide to subject Troi to an actual sexual assault. The memory of hers that is invaded involves a romantic encounter with Commander Riker. The telepathic attacker inserts himself into the memory in Riker's place and, it is implied, rapes Deanna. And John Logan must have watched this episode and liked it so much that he ripped it off for Star Trek Nemesis, where pretty much the exact same thing happens. A telepathic villain invades Deanna's mind, switches places with Riker, and forces himself on her. Many of you are probably familiar with the term rape culture. For those of you who don't know the term, or have only heard it discussed by shit-for-brains anti-feminists, rape culture refers to the normalization, minimization, and glorification of sexual violence. One way in which rape culture manifests itself in works of fiction is through the gratuitous use of sexual assault as a plot device. Like, say, showing a character being raped to establish the stakes in a story that is already an allegory for sexual assault, or having a character get raped in order to give her something to come back from, and also to establish a connection between her and the villain, which can then be exploited to help defeat the villain. It's not that any conceivable depiction of sexual violence in a TV show or movie is automatically bad. It's when it's used irresponsibly or unnecessarily or frivolously that it becomes an example of rape culture. Another example of rape culture is validating the myth that false rape allegations are widespread and pervasive. And unfortunately, Star Trek has done that as well, in an episode from TNG's third season, titled A Matter of Perspective. Like The Outcast, this is mostly an excellent episode. It's Star Trek's take on Rashomon, one of my favorite films, and features Commander Riker accused of murdering a scientist by blowing up his orbital lab, with Riker, the investigator in charge of the murder case, and the dead scientist's widow, Manua, all telling irreconcilably different versions of what happened. Manua's version includes Riker lusting after her and attempting to violently force himself on her, only to be interrupted by the scientist. Riker denies this, and the holodeck recreation of Riker we see as part of Manua's testimony doesn't match up with Riker as we know him. And Riker's version of events shows his interactions with Manua to be just the opposite. She's the one constantly coming on to him, while he nobly resists her advances. Troi does have a line where she tells Riker that she doesn't sense that Manua is lying, but that she also believes Riker's testimony. Everyone is telling the truth, but not everyone's story can be true. That's the Rashomon bit, and I like that. I just wish we could have gotten it without a plot involving a woman making a false rape accusation. Because that's what it is. To its credit, the episode doesn't depict Manua as malicious. She seems to genuinely believe that Riker tried to rape her and then murdered her husband. But the fact remains, what she says happened is not what happened. The explosion of the scientist's lab is explained in a way that exonerates Riker of the murder, and the assault accusations by Manua against Riker are just kind of dropped, as though they don't matter at all outside the context of the murder of her husband, which, now that I think about it, is another example of using sexual violence as a gratuitous plot device. Know what else I just realized? Riker, a man in a position of authority, is accused of sexual assault by a woman. Riker offers a version of the incident that makes it the woman's fault. The woman's accusations are forgotten about, and the accused man experiences no repercussions whatsoever. So that's probably the most realistic plot in the history of Star Trek. These examples I've been talking about in this video are not the only times Star Trek has been problematic. There are many more. If any of you watching have a favorite, or least favorite, I guess I should say, instance of Star Trek not being its best self, please do share it with everyone in the comments. The point of this video isn't to talk shit about Star Trek. The writers and producers of Star Trek have made quite a few mistakes over the years, but in time they have also corrected many of those mistakes. Just this past year, Star Trek Discovery reversed one of its more regrettable creative decisions when it, spoiler alert, turn away and cover your ears if you haven't watched all of Discovery yet, resurrected Dr. Culber. Star Trek sometimes gets lost, but it's also proven itself capable of finding its way again. That's because Star Trek is the product of imperfect humans. Humans who harbor biases and prejudices, humans who lack perspective and awareness, humans who are sometimes more ignorant than they realize. That doesn't mean Star Trek is bad. Obviously, I think it's pretty great. But just because I love Star Trek, that doesn't mean I should pretend that its flaws don't exist, or that the times when it's fallen short of its highest ideals didn't happen. I should acknowledge those flaws and failings, deal with them honestly, seek to understand them, and try to learn from them. And I should do that not just for Star Trek's problematic aspects, but for my own as well, so that when I fall short, when I screw up, when I'm insensitive or thoughtless or oblivious to my own ignorance or prejudice or privilege, instead of getting defensive or coming up with excuses when others make me aware of it, I can respond like a thoughtful, mature grown-up, make right any harm I may have done, and try to change. I actually think that's one of the most important lessons we can take from Star Trek. It doesn't even realize it's teaching us that lesson, but that's okay. We can still learn from it, if we're willing. Hey folks, well that's it for this episode of Trek Actually. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you got something out of it. I hope it's received in the spirit in which it was intended. You know, being critical of the media that we love is really important, and unfortunately it's not a skill that is overly valued and rewarded on the internet. So hopefully we can be the type of fans that can appreciate Star Trek, but also acknowledge its flaws and its faults and its shortcomings, and learn from those flaws and faults and shortcomings, and use them to make ourselves better people, as well as using them to increase our understanding and appreciation of Star Trek. Now, I'm going to tell you what the topic of the next Trek Actually video is in a minute, but first, I want to give shout-outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons. These are folks who have become patrons at a level of $5 a month or more since the last episode of Trek Actually, and their names are Noj Relum, thank you Noj, Vonrek Soulstrider, thank you Vonrek, Chloe D, thank you Chloe, Charles A.R., thank you Charles, Chester Plemony, thank you Chester, Morton Fagerly, thank you Morton, Tara Lioness, thank you Tara Lioness, Turnover, thank you Turnover, Charles Glau, thank you Charles, Dan Pierce, thank you Dan, Ranted Beliefs, thank you Ranted Beliefs, Louise Teeter, thank you Louise, Stephen Reinstein, thank you Stephen, Richard Moreland, thank you Richard, Mr. Sios, thank you Mr. Sios, Ken Glenn Jr., thank you Ken, Samantha Schultz, thank you Samantha, Alex Inkster, thank you Alex, Brian Evans, thank you Brian, Brian Schmidt, thank you Brian, Philip Fejcik Koval, thank you Philip, Objectively Subjective, thank you Objectively Subjective, Jose Bruna, thank you Jose, and Oasis, thank you Oasis. Thanks to everybody who is my patron at whatever level you are pledging and however long you have been pledging. Not only does a $5 or more per month pledge get you a shout out at the end of Trek Actually, but a Patreon pledge of any amount allows you to vote in the polls for the upcoming Trek Actually topics. And there is a poll for November's Trek Actually topic that is up on my Patreon page today. If you're watching this video right as it goes up, and the poll might not be up yet on my Patreon page, but in a few hours it should be up, and you can vote for November's Trek Actually topic. I'll come back to October's Trek Actually topic in a second, but first, I want to remind you, number one, please do check out Jessie Gender's video about the depiction of women in Star Trek. I already plugged it during the proper video, but I want to remind you, check out Jessie Gender's video. It is awesome. I'm not just saying that because I have a tiny little part in it and I did a little bit of voice work on it. It is linked in the description of this video. Jessie Gender has an awesome channel altogether. She's a Star Trek fan. She's a really terrific video essayist and media critic, and the video on women in Star Trek is just terrific. So check that out. I also want to remind you, if you dig the Star Trek stuff that I do and you want a little bit more, especially if you're interested in funny Star Trek stuff, I co-host a Star Trek themed podcast along with the brilliant and funny Jason Harding, and it's called The Ensign's Log, where Jason and I play characters. We play low-ranking officers on a certain legendary Federation starship as it embarks on a certain historic 5-year mission. I think you can fill in the blanks. We are getting actually shockingly close to the end of our second season of The Ensign's Log. We've been doing it for 2 years now, and it's been so much fun, and I know a lot of you are listening to it already and enjoying it, and we are so thankful for those of you who are listening to The Ensign's Log. And if you like my Star Trek videos and you haven't listened to The Ensign's Log, give it a shot, give it a chance. Listen to a couple episodes and see if it's your cup of tea. The Ensign's Log is also linked in the description of this video. You can listen on the website or on SoundCloud or subscribe via RSS using your favorite podcast app. Check out The Ensign's Log. Now, the next episode, I'll call it the next regulation episode of Trek Actually. One of my commenters said regulation Trek Actually to differentiate it from the more loose, unscripted, not actually Trek Actually videos that I do. And I really, really love that phrase, so I'm going to steal it. I'm going to call these regulation Trek Actuallys from now on, the proper scripted versions. The next one of those comes up in October, and the subject of the next regulation Trek Actually video will be, as chosen by my Patreon patrons in the most recently completed poll, when did Star Trek's eugenics wars actually happen? So it'll be really, really fun and really interesting, I think, to look at that and to look at the ways in which maybe as a long-running franchise like Star Trek keeps going for decades and decades, how you have to kind of rearrange things and juggle things around so that the established canon that in some cases is 40 and 50 years old can still coexist alongside all of the real history that has happened since then that we're all aware of as well, being residents of the real world, most of us. So that should be a really, really fun video. So that's next month. When did the eugenics wars actually happen? Check out the poll to choose the topic for November's regulation Trek Actually video. It just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Thank you all so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.